Now, you may already know this about me because maybe you've watched some of my other videos, but I am a huge advocate of following the 180-degree shutter angle rule. And essentially all that means is that your frame rate determines your shutter speed when you're shooting video. But a lot of people have an issue with that, especially when you're filming under bright lights or you're filming outside in sunlight, that it's so bright, but people still want that shallow depth of field, so they want a fast aperture. And so what they do to combat it is they jack their shutter speed up, but that can make your motion blur look really weird, and it's not ideal. It's not the proper way to do it. The proper way to do it would be to use an ND filter, but people also have issues with ND filters because they can be cumbersome and they take a while to change as you go from exposure to exposure. So you got to use lighter ND filters for one shot, and then you got to switch to darker ND filters for another shot, and it takes a lot of time. Recently, variable ND filters have become pretty popular over the last few years. And these essentially are just one filter you slap right on the camera lens, and it's two polarizers that are stacked. And as you rotate the one polarizer, you get an ND effect that you can change gradually. So as you rotate through, you can adjust really quickly, really easily how bright or dark your image is. But these variable ND filters introduce some problems to the image. They degrade sharpness. Most of the cheap ones, they're optically not very good, and you lose that sharpness and the resolution that your camera is actually capable of filming. So you'll notice with variable NDs that sometimes they actually look softer, the images look softer than they do without. These variable ND filters can also introduce color shifting, which is a problem when you're trying to match color from shot to shot. And frankly, it's quite frustrating, especially if you have to spend a lot of time in post-production correcting those issues. Because these are polarizers, they can also introduce weird polarization artifacts where the reflections on surfaces don't look quite right because of the way the variable ND filter lined up with the lens. And that's another problem. So SLR Magic sent me an email saying they've got a new Mark II version of their ND filter coming out, and they actually sent it to me right here. Now, their Mark I version was meant to address the sharpness and color shifting issue, but this Mark II version also addresses the polarization issue as well as improved sharpness, or so they say. Now, full disclosure, they did send this to me. I didn't pay for it, but they're not paying me to do this review. This is 100% my opinion. They just sent it to me and said, hey, can you try this out? And I've shot with a lot of variable ND filters, and I actually tend to stay away from them because of all the problems that I already talked about. They can introduce a lot of weird stuff, especially the cheap ones, and they're not always the most fun to use. I much prefer the regular ND filters, but frankly, those are really expensive, and each one you buy can be a couple $100 a piece. So I've always been looking for that perfect variable ND filter, and we're going to find out if this could be it. Okay, so here's the filter itself. Now, there's nothing particularly special about this packaging, although I did find it kind of nice. They supplied me with this lens cap, which I'll get to in a moment. But here is the case that the ND filter came in. Now, it's actually a fairly nice case. It's got some foam in here, keep it nice and secure. And there's the variable ND itself. And you'll notice that there are two rings. So here's the outside ring, which you can move with this lever here. And notice the hard stops. Like I can't go past that and I can't go past that, right? Minimum, maximum. Really nice, and I like it. It stops. So you have the typical variable ND that you're used to working with, but you also have this secondary ring, which allows you to determine where you actually line up the polarization with the lens. And this makes a lot more sense in some test shots that I'm going to put up in a little bit. But just know that when you mount this, you don't, unlike other variable NDs that you screw on and they're kind of locked right exactly where they are, and then you have the ND effect, this one you can actually twist and rotate and lock down in a specific orientation to the lens. So you can change the polarization of light separate from the actual ND, the density itself. So that's kind of cool. And like I said, it came with this lens cap, which is nice. Actually, a lot of the ND, the variable NDs I've used, you can't even attach a lens cap like this. So that's nice. But the one problem with this is that when the cap's on, it doesn't fit back in the box here. It's too big to close now. You could probably, you can't even force it. It's too big. So I don't know if they're going to change the packaging at all when these finally start shipping, but I did think that was a problem. So you have to kind of have the lens cap separate, which is unfortunate if you want to actually use it. So rather than having everything nice in one box, you've got to find two places for everything. Not a huge deal. It is nice that they give it to you, but would have been nice if it all fit right in here. So let's look at some actual shots. This first shot is what you would typically get if you weren't using an ND filter of any kind, but still wanted shallow depth of field by using a faster aperture. So in this shot, I've got my aperture set to f4, and I'm actually using an 11-degree shutter speed, which is about the fastest shutter angle you can pick on the GH4. And you'll see in the leaves that the motion blur, there actually isn't hardly any motion blur because the shutter is moving so fast, and that's not ideal. That's not going to make your movement and action look normal and natural. The eye sees motion blur, so you definitely want to have that. So shooting like this is not what you want to do, especially outside, especially in bright conditions. You want to keep that shutter at 180 degrees in almost all circumstances. So that's why you need to use an ND filter. If you don't use an ND filter but still follow the 180-degree shutter angle rule, this is what your footage is going to look like. You've got a much deeper depth of field. You got more depth of field shooting at f16. And frankly, most people don't find this as cinematic or filmic. They want that shallow depth of field. So you need to find a good ND filter so you can do these kind of shots with a shallow depth of field outdoors. So this is what you can get when shooting with an ND filter, like the SLR Magic Variable ND filter Mark II. I've got my shutter at 180 degrees, and I can shoot nice and shallow at f2.8, keeping my ISO down low around 200. Now, I did shoot this a little bit overexposed, but pay attention to the reflections, the light bouncing off those leaves into the camera lens, because I'm going to address that here when I talk about polarization. Here I've rotated the filter to show the different angles of polarization you can set and lock on this Mark II variable ND. It's really nice that you can set and pick this right on the filter because a lot of variable NDs you can't do this. You're stuck with whatever polarization you get once you screw the variable ND on. And with the SLR Magic Variable ND Mark II, you can actually pick this, dial it in, and lock it in place depending on the look you're going for. Here's the same shot, same settings, but this is using my ProMaster variable ND. This is an ND I picked up for around 75 bucks, and I've used it, and it's okay for what it is, but it has a lot of the problems, as you'll see in some of these other tests. But here's the same shot, and you can get that shallow depth of field, you can get that look, but you'll notice that the bokeh actually is a little bit different compared to the SLR Magic. And that's just anything you put in front of the lens is going to affect the characteristics of your image. So it is kind of interesting to compare the two and how the one looks compared to the other. And believe it or not, you can actually pick your polarization with this ProMaster. You can rotate that filter, but because it doesn't have a locking ring, you're now on loose filter threads. So you can rotate it, but it's not secure. It's not repeatable. It's not something you want to trust. A filter half rotated in isn't usually what you want. So it's much nicer on the SLR Magic filter being able to lock that in, set it in place, and know that it's not moving anywhere. This ProMaster does not have that feature, and you can make it work in kind of a hack, like half screwed in, but it really is not how you want to be filming. Here I put a white piece of paper up in the shade to test the color shifting of these variable NDs. This is the paper, no filter, with a custom white balance set to the piece of paper. So this is what it should look like. Best case scenario, no filters, nothing, just the stock lens. Now using the SLR Magic Variable ND, you can see that it's maybe a tad bit warmer, but this is certainly well within the realm of good, acceptable color. And I'm not seeing anything here that strikes me as being distracting or bad or shifting too much one way or the other. It's just maybe a tad bit warmer, but like I said, it's very, very close to the regular lens. And this is the variable ND set at its minimum value. Now I've switched the SLR Magic Variable ND about halfway through its ND range, and you can see color is still looking true, still looking accurate, maybe still a tad bit warm as compared to that original lens, but not much has shifted or changed. And here's the SLR Magic Variable ND at its maximum density. You can see I'm now shooting at f2.8, ISO 6400. I actually had to bump it up to get exposure proper, but no color shifting here. If there is any, it's very minimal and something that you could fix with color correction, or something that you might not even care about because, it's a tad bit warmer. Maybe that's what you want. Here's an ugly looking shot from the ProMaster. Now, this is at maximum ND on the ProMaster. It can actually go darker, but it's not even usable. It's just a black hole right in the center of the image. But this is the kind of weird cross effect you can get with some of these variable NDs that say they go really, really dark. You'll see that on the ProMaster, you can actually get darker images from it compared to the SLR Magic, but they're not usable. You get this weird cross patterning, and I can't imagine ever wanting to use a shot that looks like this. But to use it in its acceptable range, this is the ProMaster, and compared to the SLR Magic, I'm really not seeing that big of a color difference either. It looks fairly neutral, fairly standard. You might see a little bit of something here compared to the original, but it's still well within that range of being acceptable and being able to color grade it to your preference. You're not getting anything super weird. And this is the ProMaster at maximum density, or the maximum usable density. And I'm pretty impressed. It actually looks pretty good and no color shifting here. There are some other ND filters out there, variable ND filters, that do introduce some really weird color, and even cheap regular ND filters can introduce some really weird color. I bought a set at one point of really cheap regular ND filters, and they're just absolute trash. So really be on the lookout for whatever ND you're putting in front of your lens. Anytime you're putting anything in front of your lens, make sure that it's doing what you want and it's not going to introduce any weird color and change the spectrum of lighting, because you just don't want to have to deal with that, especially if it's not doing it evenly across the image, because that's a whole nother problem entirely. Here you can see the ProMaster variable ND about halfway through its range. And again, there's not any significant weird color issues going on. It's looking pretty neutral. And finally, here's the ProMaster at its minimum density. Same thing, color looks fairly good. Here's another shot where I'm using the ProMaster and I'm actually not threading it in all the way onto the lens, so I can kind of show that polarization effect, especially with skies. Now, if you use a variable ND and you screw it on all the way tight and you get these big black holes in the sky, you're going to have to unscrew the filter, screw it back on, and hope you get it in an orientation where you're not having that issue. Now, that's a really big hassle and a really big pain, which is why I'm glad there's the SLR Magic Variable ND. With the SLR Magic Variable ND, you're still going to notice a similar issue with polarization, but you can line the filter up to counteract it and combat it, so you're not stuck with a weird black hole in the sky, and you can actually set it and lock it down to avoid that issue. Now let's talk about sharpness. Most people, they want sharp, highly detailed, crisp, clean images, and this is with the lens right off the bat just filming some boring rock wall. And this is 11-degree shutter, so very, very fast shutter speed. But this is just to illustrate the sharpness aspect of the lens. So this is without any filters, bare lens, and there you can see very sharp, very clean. With the SLR Magic Variable ND on, that sharpness is still coming through. There might be a very, very, very minimal hit. And you know, when we're looking at this stuff at 100%, you might notice it. But for the most part, this is almost, if not as sharp as the lens alone, which is really, really nice to see. I love that this ND filter isn't affecting sharpness in any dramatic way, because a lot of them do, and it's really frustrating when you're trying to get sharp in focus images and everything's kind of blurry, everything's a little bit hazy because you threw a cheap variable ND on front of the lens. Here's the ProMaster variable ND, and this one you can actually see it's not as sharp. There's a visible difference between this and the SLR Magic variable ND. And you know, a lot of people are out there buying really expensive cameras that'll shoot 4K, and they're buying really expensive lenses, really nice glass that's really sharp, and then they throw a cheap filter or a cheap ND in front of the lens, and they totally ruin all that detail that they should be getting because they wanted to go cheap on the ND filter. So it really is important that every step in the process, you're not degrading your image by throwing something on there that's subpar, that's not optically good quality. You want really good stuff that's not going to affect the sharpness like this ProMaster is. Frankly, this is, you know, in that realm where I probably might not want to use it because it's just not as sharp as I like my images to be. And since I'd been filming nothing but rocks and trees, I figured I'd throw some skin tone in there as well. So here you can look at my face. This is the camera and lens without any filtration. And here's the same shot with the SLR Magic Variable ND Mark II. Again, you're seeing a little bit of that warmth coming through from the filter, but if it's something you don't prefer, it's easily fixable in post-production. And there you go, there's some skin tones to look at. And here's the ProMaster Variable ND with the exact same settings as the SLR Magic Variable ND. One thing I absolutely hate about some ND filters and some filters in general is that you can get some weird ghosting artifacts if you're filming something that's bright or a hot spot within the scene. So you'll notice I've got this bright window on the right hand side of the frame, but on the left hand side of the frame you can see a ghost image of that bright spot. And it's happening with the ProMaster variable ND here. And frankly, it's a reason why I don't use this variable ND all that often, because if I am filming with, let's say, a window in the background or something a little bit brighter, you can get these weird ghost patterns which shouldn't be there and frankly are pretty hard to fix or correct in post-production, and they can be quite distracting. Without any filter of any kind, you can see that that same effect doesn't appear. There's no weird ghost image on the left-hand side, and it's looking nice and clean as it should. So I was absolutely thrilled to see the SLR Magic Variable ND Mark II does not have this effect. You can see bright right-hand side of the screen, and there's no ghosting going on the left. It's very similar to how the camera and lens were functioning without any filtration of any kind. So it's wonderful that this filter is able to do this, because a lot of the other variable NDs and other filters in general out there, you will get weird ghost images like this. And I love that I'm not seeing it in the SLR Magic Variable ND Mark II. I'm incredibly satisfied with the SLR Magic Variable ND. It's so nice to have these kind of professional features like the hard stops and the angle of adjustment in terms of polarization, but also the increased sharpness you get with this, the lack of ghosting you get with this. It's so much nicer than other variable NDs that I've used. And you know, I haven't used every single one of them out there, but out of the ones I have used, this is fantastic. I definitely think it's worth it, especially if you are working on stuff that you need to make sure is as sharp as possible, that you aren't getting any weird ghosting or lens flares or anything like that. You're not getting a weird ND cross effect. Because these aren't actual ND filters and they're using polarizers, there are a lot of artifacts, and SLR Magic seems to have solved most of those problems with this variable ND.